I'm Kim Dozier, a Time contributor, and I'm joined by Julia Gillard, the 27th Australian Prime Minister. Ms. Gillard, welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Great to be with you.
Well, I'd like to start with the news that we're all living right now, a global pandemic with no end in sight. The one possibly positive thing about the pandemic is that it has highlighted the global leadership of women like New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern and Germany's Angela Merkel. What do you think the pandemic has shown us about what women's leadership can bring at a crisis like this?
I'm always a little careful when we talk about women's leadership because I'm not a believer that, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that men and women's brains are somehow inherently different and that means that they always lead differently. But men and women have certainly been socialised differently. And because we perceive women leaders through the prism of gender still, we tend to give political consent to female leaders if they come across as both strong and empathetic. They can't look weak, otherwise we don't think that they've got what it takes to lead, but they must look empathetic as well, otherwise we think that they're kind of, nasty and unlikable. So it's no surprise to me that because women leaders tend to exhibit those character traits, that they've come to the fore during a global pandemic when all of us want to know that our leaders have got what it takes to get us through, but we want them to understand how we're feeling emotionally in this time of great anxiety as well.
So it's their skill at emotional intelligence that is the added benefactor that a lot of male leaders don't necessarily get training in growing up.
I think we can certainly say this is a time in which that absolute strongman, blustering, crash-through style of leadership, I'm thinking here of people like President Bolsonaro of Brazil, that style of leadership hasn't worked. You might be able to bluff your way through a series of political crises, but you can't do it with a virus. You've got to be precise, you've got to be scientific. Angela Merkel, because of her scientific training, has certainly shown that ability. Jacinda Ardern has certainly shown the sort of nurturing, empathetic kindness that I think people are looking for. So I do hope that we emerge out of this with a new dialogue around women's leadership, a new understanding about the benefits of combining strength and empathy in our leaders. And we ask that of all leaders, men and women, because we've got a lot to do in this world and clearly we need the best people trying to steer us as we confront the aftermath of the global pandemic.
Now, I'd like to talk about your time as the leader in Australia. You tried for the first couple of years to ignore the sexism thing, and then you gave your famous misogyny speech, as it's now called, that still got millions of hits on YouTube, where you had reached the end of your rope with the leader of the opposition. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about, and do you think anything's changed for women in your country?
Well, let me start with the positive news. I do think things have changed. I think things have changed here in Australia and I think they're changing around the world, but nowhere near fast enough. We need to see a far greater pace of change. What's certainly changed here in Australia is when I was Prime Minister, the fashionable political commentary was that no part of how I was being received as Prime Minister was because of my gender, that was just irrelevant and everybody was reacting to me exactly the same way that they would have reacted to a man in the same circumstances. Now, of course, we're having a lively debate here and around the world about women in leadership, a debate that I've sought to contribute to through co-authoring a book on women in leadership to talk about all of these experiences. So that's the positive news. For me, back in 2012, I did get to a stage, having not engaged on issues of sexism, where I was in a parliamentary circumstance where I knew that we would be talking about sexism that day. There were a very specific set of circumstances. The Speaker of our House of Representatives had been shown to have sent some very sexist text messages, so that was going to be the topic of the day. I went in ready ready for what we have as question time, ready to answer questions about the speaker, but instead we moved straight into a debate, and what's become known as the misogyny speech was my speech in reply to the Leader of the Opposition, and I think it did unleash all of the frustration that I'd felt up until that moment.
Now, I realize that Tony Abbott never said, "ditch the witch." That was a sign that he was standing next to. But he said a lot of other unkind things to a woman politician. Did you ever get an apology from him?
No, I didn't. And look, I wouldn't really expect one either. I think in Australia we play our parliamentary politics hard. I certainly was of the view then, and I'm still of the view now, that much of the way it was played against me was relying on sexist stereotypes, and I'm not just personalising that to the Leader of the Opposition. I think that happened more broadly than him in the Parliament, in the media, in the commentariat generally, when people came to Parliament House holding up signs, "ditch the witch," and calling me a bitch and things like that. Clearly, gender was at the forefront. But rather than look back and think about apologies or anything like that, my outlook has been to take those experiences and to see what we can all learn from them and to then look forward. So that's led me to working with King's College London on a Global Institute for Women's Leadership. So we're deepening the research base about what enables women to come through for leadership, and then writing with my dear colleague, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a book which we hope globally will help people, men and women, think about what we need to do to create a world where women can come through for leadership without artificial barriers in their way.
Now, I wanted to talk about your book, Women in Leadership, it's called. It's out in the Pacific region where you are. It's coming out in the United States next February. You interviewed 8 women leaders, current and former, including people like Hillary Clinton. What were some of the common lessons and wisdom you found across their different experiences and yours?
What I really learned in doing these interviews and in writing the book is 2 things. I mean, one, we interviewed women from incredibly different circumstances. You know, Hillary Clinton, Erna Solberg in Norway, Theresa May in the United Kingdom, Jacinda in New Zealand, and the list goes on. But we also interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia, Joyce Banda from Malawi. And you would think at first instance that those cultures and contexts are so different that there wouldn't be much shared experience. And yet what we found was, you know, sexism and its manifestations are effectively universal. Whilst the amplitude of them varies from place to place, the way women leaders live that experience has so much in common. So that really surprised me. Another thing that really was very much reinforced in my mind from working on the book is we take the research that's been done about women in leadership, often in sort of laboratory style conditions, universities, testing how people see women leaders using groups of students or the like, and we tried to see how much of that lived in the real world. Most of it did. And so the research that shows that we quickly conclude that women leaders are unlikable, for example, those sexist stereotypes we still have whispering in the back of all of our brains do still translate into lived reality for women leaders.
Now, you have talked about being put on a pedestal as a woman's leader is a mug's game because everyone expects the women that they have to perform better than everybody else. What do you mean by that?
I think there's a tendency, and as someone who's spent a lifetime in the women's movement, I'm going to own up to this tendency as much as anybody else in the world, that when we see a woman come through in what has historically been a domain for men, we all just say, you know, that's an amazing achievement, and we should say that. But then we do tend to put her on a pedestal. It's the sort of golden girl phenomenon, as if because she's been the first to get through, that she is, you know, without flaw. She is perfect. She is to almost be venerated because she is so remarkable. And the trap in that for the woman leader is as soon as she does something, not even wrong, just human. You know, perhaps a little short-tempered in a moment, a little bit more aggressive than people have come to expect, a lapse in a demeanour of kindness, then there's the crash off the pedestal and the woman falls in community expectations and community support. And we'd be better off to say we want women to come through. Yes, remarkable women do come through, but they will always be a mix of strengths and weaknesses, and we shouldn't create a high jump bar for them, which is higher than we expect male leaders to clear. We should be looking at the same standard, so not expecting perfection, because you know what, there isn't a human being on the planet who's perfect, and there's no woman going for leadership who's going to be perfect.
So situations where a short-tempered man is passionate, a short-tempered woman is she unstable? That kind of double standard you're talking about.
Oh, exactly. A woman who has done assertive things, perhaps been on a parliamentary committee or inquiry where she's very assertively, even aggressively questioned a witness. A man who did that would be seen as, you know, going after it, as making sure that the truth came out, as being tough, as being strong. A woman doing that, very likely to be described as nasty. In fact, it's caught my eye that one of the first things that President Trump has said about Kamala Harris is he's used the word nasty. So I think he's already conjuring with these sexist tropes that women who come forward, who are ambitious and rightly ambitious, who have got the capacity to lead, who have done in the past strong things, are unlikable. He's basically already wanting people to conclude that they, you know, won't warm to Kamala Harris as the candidate for vice president. And there's gender baked into that.
And if you were her, what advice would you give her?
Well, she's a very, very experienced person, so I don't know if she needs my advice, but what we certainly say in the book for women who are aspiring is, you know, we'd love to be able to say you will step out into a world of gender equality, but the reality is you won't. You'll step out into a world where there's still a disproportionate focus on your appearance, a disproportionate focus on your family structures, where if you fall the wrong side of this strength and empathy tightrope, that people may conclude that you're really unlikable, that you're really prickly, that you're hard to get along with. We say in the book, and the evidence shows this, that there's less circumference for women to make errors, that if they make a mistake, then they get more of a payback than men. So I would say to any woman aspiring for leadership, be aware these things are going to happen, and war game in advance what your response is going to be. Don't be blindsided. Don't be caught in the moment. I'm sure Kamala Harris, having watched Hillary Clinton in 2016, that she and her team are well across these aspects.
Now, I've also noticed that after leaving office, you've mostly stayed away from politics, whereas a lot of your colleagues have spoken loud and clear about their thoughts about current events. Why have you taken that step back?
Well, I took a step back from Australian domestic contemporary politics. I formed the view that having served as Prime Minister, that when that period came to an end, that it was time to move on and to build the next bit of my life, and that it wasn't fair to the current generation that's still in there, particularly my Labor colleagues, for me to be looming up over their shoulder with my daily advice about what to do next. They're a talented generation. They'll work it out. If anybody needs my advice or perspective, they can obviously pick up the phone and get it privately. I don't have to be on the airwaves doing that. So better for them, but ultimately too, better for me, because if I was going to move on to a productive next stage in my life, then I needed to leave that day-to-day political contest behind and get on with the next bit, and that's what I'm doing now.
Well, if I could try one political question, Australia is in a deep recession. It's facing rising tensions with China. What does the nation need to do to remain a positive force in the region at this time?
Oh, look, I'm hugely confident Australia will be a positive force in the region, and I'm happy to say that because, in my view, that's a commentary almost above and beyond politics. We are a nation that well and truly understands our geography, the benefits and the tensions in this region of the world. We are, of course, a very strong and staunch ally of the United States. We've needed over a long period of time to work on our relationship with China as China has continued to rise as a global force. It falls to every Prime Minister to balance those two, and sometimes they are more easily put in balance, sometimes finding that is more complicated. But I'm very confident that over the sweep of many years, so this isn't a commentary about the current government, over the sweep of many years that Australia will continue to navigate its way productively through any tensions that arise.
You've devoted a lot of your time after leaving office to education. Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says up to 1 billion children have had their schooling affected by the pandemic. How do you make sure that the world's most vulnerable children don't get left behind?
One of the many hats I wear is as chair of the Global Partnership for Education, which is the global body that focuses on school education in developing countries. And we're very concerned because the evidence from past epidemics like Ebola is that if schools close, the most marginalised children, particularly the most marginalised girls, never get back to school when they reopen. They end up as child brides or child labourers, and that's it. That's school done for them. And so we've been working in this period with developing country partners to try and maintain educational continuity. Now, for many children in Australia, in other parts of the world, educational continuity is about, technology. It's about video conferencing, all of that. In the parts of the world where we work, it's much more about old-fashioned solutions, not new technology solutions. So it's radio, television, the distribution of print materials to children. So we've been working on that. And then we will be working with developing country partners so that as schools reopen, there is tracing, there's ways of making sure every child returns and is supported to return and is supported to make up whatever gap in their education has emerged because they've been out of school for that period.
Huge job. I also had wanted to ask you about mental health. You've spoken about how mental health is really taking a hit because of the pandemic. And you've also lived through some really tough times in your life. Can you share some lessons with viewers out there? How do you get through this?
Yeah, I think this is a uniquely tough time in the sense that we're social creatures where people need people, as the old song would tell us. People do need people. And if you're feeling very isolated, particularly if you live alone and you're in quite stringent lockdown conditions, so you're really not having any face-to-face interaction with other human beings of a deep or meaningful connection, that does weigh heavily on people. And whilst new technology can provide some sort of substitute, we all know that it's not quite the same as being in a physical presence where you can share a hug and really be human beings in a moment together. So we are saying to people, and when I say we, I chair Australia's major mental health body, Beyond Blue, a major advocacy body. We are saying to people, if you feel that you're getting into trouble, don't wait to reach out for support. Reach out to family, friends, but also to mental health agencies and bodies, because early intervention, prevention makes a profound difference. So don't wait until it's really in a very dark place before you first reach out for help. For me, in my life, I've always been able to rely on the support of family and friends. That's what's got me through, and I'm conscious that that's what's most missing for people during lockdown conditions now. But I'm also a big believer that resilience is a muscle, that you can work it. So, early trials and challenges in my life enabled me to think through not only what it was like to take a fall, but what it was like to get back up. And my advice to anyone now as they go through their life journey is, no matter how mild the setback, think about it, think about how you're going to respond to it, and then as you work your way through that, then when the setbacks are more profoundly challenging, you will have worked that resilience muscle and got it a bit stronger.
Former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kim.